What's up, my friend? Welcome to this exclusive workshop. And I'm beyond excited to share this material with you, honestly. And I'm honored that you decided to take some time out of your day to spend with me. And I really hope you find this material valuable. I put this together because a lot of my students have been asking about a step-by-step framework that they can take and apply to their music to really just make the entire music making process simpler and easier. And I thought this was the best solution to do just that. So I hope you enjoy. And without any further ado, let's dive on in. And I promise to give you some good stuff today. So, my goal by the end of this workshop is to show you the complete framework for taking an initial idea and turning it into a finalized piece of music ready for release. This is going to be so juicy. And in addition to that, I also want to share with you my 3-step virtual orchestration roadmap for taking your music, your mockup, and work with efficiency on your virtual orchestrations every single time. So this is going to be so helpful as well. It's something I follow all the time and I share with my students as well privately. So you're going to get this in this workshop today. So just to give you a little bit of context, in my background, so you know where I'm coming from, I personally always loved creating music. I started piano at the age of 5. I was trained classically, and I entered plenty of competitions and festivals growing up. I've had the opportunity to perform with an orchestra. I remember doing a Beethoven concerto that was really fun, and I also achieved my ARCT in piano by age 14, which was basically the highest level of piano at the time. Now they have additional levels, but that was my background basically. And in high school, this is where my creative journey really started. I was inspired by two of my close friends. One of them was a DJ, and the other improvised on the piano nearly every single day. And so we kind of had like a friendly rivalry of like who's the better musician, right? But you can see how this was important to me because one of them being a DJ, he really enjoyed doing turntables and producing music on the computer, and that's what opened my eyes to technology in music. And the other friend who improvised, he opened me up to composing in general and coming up with ideas on the piano, enjoying the process, and it's been history ever since. And so, yeah, that kickstarted my love for writing songs and short piano pieces. And soon afterwards, I discovered the world of sampling and music technology, and that leads us to where we are today. Now, the only problem was I realized that my orchestrations simply weren't up to scratch, and I had to learn that the hard way. So, although writing, like composing, actually came easy to me, the most difficult part was figuring out how to arrange my songs properly, like choosing the right instrumentation. So I had close to no idea what orchestral instruments really sounded like because although I had gone to classical concerts as a kid, I never really paid attention that much. I never really ingrained those sounds into my head. So I was always guessing when it came to my mock-ups, and that's never a good recipe for success, right? And in addition, the stock sounds included in my DAW, I was using Ableton Live at the time, and then eventually I switched over to Logic. They just weren't up to scratch in terms of realism and programming. Like you can imagine a basic strings patch in Ableton Live or even Logic, they don't really have legato. There's no recorded transitions, right? So that in itself sounds a bit synthetic, and it doesn't really help if you're trying to create a realistic mockup. Not to mention, my mixing and mastering skills were non existent basically, so I had no clue how to take my existing tracks and polish them up to a professional level, which is obviously a workflow that is really important. I think most composers struggle with mixing and mastering, and that's a very important thing that we're going to touch on later as well. So that's when I decided to take my orchestrations more seriously. I took it like one step at a time. I dove into the world of sample libraries and virtual orchestration, going deep down, learning how to create orchestral mockups that not only sound realistic, but also enhance my musical message and impact other people at the same time. And it's been such a fulfilling journey, and that's what I want to share with you as well. And as my skills improved, I had wonderful opportunities to work with some super talented composers and musicians all around the world, including Tina Guo, who's the cellist for Hans Zimmer, and Catherine Dern. She's written for tons and tons of films. David Wise scored Donkey Kong Country. Stephen Millen's a video game composer. Fox Chase, Jonathan and Friends, they're both pop artists and singers, and a whole bunch of other artists. And all this to say, you can absolutely write incredible music and produce once you have those necessary skills, which is why I think it's so important that we have that clear framework and roadmap to follow step by step so we know how to go from that initial idea to the complete final master. All right? So with that being said, let's dive on into this the framework. The first step number one is composition. All right? I think that makes sense, coming up with those musical ideas. So let's first address, why is composition so important? Well, this is really fundamental because we want to get all the notes down in their entirety. Before we move on to arrangement, before we want to apply any instruments, we have to get the basic notes first because that is the foundation of the music. It really doesn't matter if your arrangement is amazing, if the musical ideas aren't up to scratch, nothing else matters. So there are three ways that you can start a piece of music, and I've used all three, but they are the melody first. So you start with the melody, right? And you can use a period or a sentence structure as the basis of your theme. Both the period and the sentence are like 8-bar themes. You have basic ideas and you have contrasting ideas, but generally you follow one of those structures to create a nice satisfying melody, and that sets a good tone for the rest of your piece, whether or not you expand it to different sections or you repeat the theme, etc. But melody first is a really common option. Then we have harmony as well. So starting with harmony, you could use a chord progression to inspire your track. You might have a single chord that sustains for a long period of time. Maybe you add a melody on top of that. Lots of composers do this as well. And then you can also start with rhythm first. This is the third step, the third approach, starting with a groove, like a percussive rhythm. So that sets the rhythmic foundation of the piece. And just think about pop songs, radio pop. They always have some sort of groove that they can follow. You can bob your head to. It's really easy for the layperson to understand and digest. And so that's why these approaches are super common, all three of them. But if you're asking which one's my personal favorite, I tend to write melodies first because I truly believe melody is king, and a great melody will stay in your listener's mind for long, long periods of time. Of course, the other two elements are important, but what is ideal is if you can hear all three elements at the same time while you write. So nowadays, when I hear a melody in my head, not only do I hear the melody, but I also have the rhythm of the melody. I also know the harmony, like I know the chords underneath that I want to play. And as a bonus, sometimes I'll also hear the arrangement as well, the full orchestration, because that feels the best. That's honestly so inspiring to not only hear the musical aspects, but also the arrangement. And then it's just a matter of replicating those instruments in your DAW, right? So you want to get to that point where you feel like you can come up with all three elements at the same time. So with that being said, let me share with you a few of my favorite devices for creating incredible music and making it stand out. In terms of your melody, it's kind of underrated to keep it simple. A lot of composers try to overcomplicate their melodies, not on purpose, of course, but their melodies kind of sound like they wander and there really is no footing. Maybe they use tons of non-chord tones or they switch up the rhythms all the time or things like that. But if you can take a simple motive and repeat it, right? Repetition is really, really powerful, and keep it diatonic, meaning you stay within the major or the minor scale, whichever key you're in. That is going to make it feel more comforting and more familiar, which is a recipe for success. And it's more comforting because it's more familiar to everyday people who digest music. So keeping it simple is always a great idea. And one other point I want to share here is mix in leaps with your steps and your skips. So the smaller the intervals you have in your melody, like seconds and thirds and like steps, right? That sounds more conversational. It's simpler in that regard because in normal everyday language, our voices don't go up and down that much if we're just talking about everyday topics. But if you have topics that are more exciting or you're angry or something, then you're going to raise your voice, right? And that expresses more emotion. So mixing in larger leaps, like intervals larger than a fourth, a fifth, maybe a sixth, seven, an octave, when you throw those in as well, those accentuate those moments that you're leaping. And it really just pulls the ear because it's like a big leap up or down. So you want to put in those as well with your steps and skips every so often. So it feels like there's some variety and the melody is almost telling a story, which is really cool. And then we already talked about not being afraid to repeat motifs as well. In terms of harmony, you can stick with diatonic harmony as well, like keeping it simple within the key. But what I really like is to use modal mixture and secondary dominance. So just really quickly, modal mixture is when you take the parallel key. So if I'm in the key of C major, then C minor would be the parallel minor. So it's the same tonic, the same root note, but the opposite quality, right? And then you borrow chords from that parallel key and incorporate those chords into your original key. So if I'm in the key of C major, I'll use some chords from C minor and bring it into my chord progression. One common example is maybe one, so major one, like C major to F minor to C major, because usually the 4 chord or the F chord in C major is F major. It's a happy sound. But if you bring in a minor 4 or a F minor chord in between your C major chords, then that kind of creates a sadder sound. So it's like happy, sad, happy. And if you're in front of your keyboard, you can actually try this out right now. You'll see how that actually sounds. It's really beautiful. Another device I like to use is, flat 6 and to flat 7 to 1, because in C major, flat 6 would be A flat, right? And then flat 7 would be B flat. So A flat major and the B flat major chords are actually inside the C natural minor scale, the parallel minor. So if putting those into your chord progressions can also add some touches of color that are not present in the regular C major scale, because C major has no sharps and flats, right? So it's a really creative device that you can use there as well. Then secondary dominants, really quickly, are when you take a chord other than your tonic chord and find the 5 chord of that chord. So going back to C major, if the 5 chord is G major, then what's the 5 chord of G major? Well, it's actually D major, which has an F sharp in the middle. D, F sharp, A, right? So that F sharp is a non-diatonic note, which means it doesn't belong to the key of C major. And that means it introduces a new color, and it makes us feel like, oh, we've kind of explored somewhere new. And then if you resolve that D chord to the G chord, which is the regular 5 in C major, and then resolve that to C major, then you're going from D to G to C, and it sounds really natural. Because you're visiting the key of G for a second, but then you're going back to G, which then resolves to C, and it's just a really pretty resolution in that way. So these are just a couple devices you can use, but really, really useful. And then a lot of people ask, what's the right structure for my music, right? And I have a couple preferences. I like to at least aim for 2 contrasting sections or more if you want a longer piece. But the simple ternary form, like having an A section and then a B section with the A coming back to round it out, is a super common form that's really satisfying. And then the other one I like to use is AABC. So it's like I have a main theme, I repeat that main theme, then I can go to the B section, and then maybe a C section being the chorus that can round it out really beautifully as well before we loop back to the beginning if it's like a video game piece of music. Here's just a little pro tip. Perform your piece on a single instrument. And my instrument of choice is the piano, obviously, as a classically trained pianist. But the goal of this is really to play it out and to see if it makes you feel something. If it does, then it's a great piece of music that stands on its own, So if you play your piece of music on the keys and it doesn't really make you feel anything, or on your instrument of choice, then maybe you can add something else to it to spice it up a bit. Maybe switch out a chord or two to make it non-diatonic, or make your melody more interesting. Switch up the key, modulate, right? Like if you can feel something, maybe it's happiness, excitement, maybe it's sadness, maybe that's what you're trying to achieve. You want to have some sort of emotion from your music in its bare form on one single instrument. And if you can feel that, then you're ready to continue to the next steps. Okay. So that's a big recommendation I share with all my students. Hope that makes sense. Let's move on to step number 2, and that is production. So now we're moving into the technology side of things a little bit. So let me share with you the 6 home basics for every studio that you should have. Number 1 is your computer, obviously, right? If you're watching this workshop, you're either watching on a phone or a tablet, iPad, or a computer. And whether it's PC, Mac, Linux, whatever system it is, you need a system that allows you to record instruments, also host different software, and produce music virtually. So if you want to produce music, you're going to need to have some sort of operating system and computer of some sort. I think that's the obvious one. But going in a little bit deeper, we also need a DAW, which stands for the Digital Audio Workstation. And a DAW is a specific piece of software that allows you to not only record instruments, but also edit and mix it, and also bounce or export your final track. And a little shortcut I put here is to learn your shortcuts, meaning like if you want to play, like start or stop the track, you don't have to like click the play or the stop button every single time moving your mouse around. You should map it to a key of your choice on your keyboard, like the space bar. I use the space bar. I use the return or enter key to move the playhead back to the very beginning. I use Q for quantizing. I use M for mute, S for solo, things like that. So learning your shortcuts saves you so many hours over time, and I would highly recommend doing that to really build a great workflow. It doesn't really matter what DAW you're using, by the way, as long as you have a workflow that suits you. The third thing is the audio interface, and this is what bridges your microphone and your DAW in most cases. So it basically converts the incoming audio signal into readable language for your computer. And the one that I'm using at the moment is called the Apogee one. I'm using a Blueberry microphone, right now to speak, right? And that is connected to the audio interface, the Apogee, which then connects via USB into my computer. So it's kind of like the middleman, transferring the audio signal into readable languages for the computer to process and spit out as an audio file. Now, sometimes you don't even need an audio interface because it's already built into your computer. So I could just hook up a USB mic straight into my computer and speak into the mic, and that computer can read it because it has its own built-in audio interface, which is really cool too. But dedicated ones tend to sound clearer, a little cleaner, they might have some more detail, etc. So there's pros and cons to both. Moving on to number 4, we have instruments, right? So we're talking about orchestral stuff, obviously. So most likely you're going to be using virtual orchestral instruments. But whether you use real or sampled instruments, you're going to need instruments to produce what you're hearing in your head. I think that's more or less obvious, but it is important as well because we need libraries to create what we hear in our head. Number 5 is headphones and or studio monitors. So what is your listening system? Something that can play back the music that you're hearing and also accurately at that. So I personally use headphones more than speakers, but I also have speakers in case I want to have a different perspective. But that's completely up to you as well, as long as it's accurate for your purposes. And 6th and finally is external hard drives. So these are essential for storing your sample libraries on, especially as you build your toolkit. A lot of people like to store libraries straight on their computer, but I don't like this method because I think you can store a lot better stuff on there, like documents, really important things, video clips, whatever you want to do. And then I like to store my libraries on external drives. So I have both HDDs and I have SSDs as well, for different purposes, but they all host my libraries. So I plug them in every time I want to produce music because it streams the samples directly from those drives into my DAW. Okay? So even if you don't have all 6 of these, I would recommend having at least 4 or 5 of them. Ideally all 6, but you can also have way more stuff. I just like to keep things simple. I prefer to have a minimalist mindset when it comes to this sort of thing. So I would encourage that for you as well. And it saves you a lot of money as well. Okay. So that's step number 2, which is production. Step number 3 is orchestration. This is the part where a lot of us get really, really excited, and for good reason. It's the creative part after the composing itself, right? Writing the music. So let me run through really quickly the essentials of orchestration. First of all, the string family has 4 unique sections, right? We have the violins, violas, cellos, and basses. Usually the violins are separated into violins 1 and violins 2 in the context of a symphony orchestra. So then you have 5 unique sections, which then you can assign to multiple voices. And in terms of the characteristics, they usually have a pretty homogeneous sound overall because they are relatively similar in construction. The way they were built is pretty similar. So no matter which instrument in the family you're using, you pretty much have a similar sound overall. And that means they layer well with other sections and on their own too. So violins and violas can create a really thick sound that still sound like strings, but strings also have a good foundation for other instrument families to layer on top of them as well, including the woodwinds and the brass, which we'll look at in a second. But the woodwinds have 4 main instruments, and then they also have their doublers as well. But we have the flute, the clarinet, the oboe, and the bassoon. My favorite being the oboe. And the main differences here between the woodwinds and the strings is that they have a very unique color for each instrument that is in the orchestra here. So these 4 have their own sound that's very distinct. So that means they're really great for soloists to have a standout color and for blending into other textures if you want to create a different sound than just like, let's say, a string sound, right? If you double a flute into the violin playing unison, it's going to add a little breathy sound or a little warmer sound, right? If you put in an oboe with the violins, then it's going to sound a little bit fuller in the top end maybe, or it's going to sound a bit more reedy, a bit more high end, right? So the way you combine, the way you decide to layer instruments influences the texture quite a bit. Then we move on to the brass, and the brass has 4 unique instruments as well. We have the trumpet, French horn, trombone, and tuba, kind of going from top to bottom. The brass are really cool because they have a large dynamic and timbral range, meaning they can go really soft, but they can also play really loud. But not only that, the tone of the sound itself can be very versatile as well, from very warm and rich to very searing and brassy and like blowing your ears out. It really has that quality that cuts through a concert hall really, really well, right? and so that they can perform melodic and supportive roles equally well, like choral pads or soaring melodies if you so desire. Keep in mind that the woodwinds and the brass both have to they have to breathe. So if you're writing lines for them, you have to create breathing points for them in between your phrases. Essentially, go with what feels natural, but generally at the end of a phrase. Then we have the percussion. Some of the common instruments include the bass drum, the snare drum, timpani, cymbals, toms, piano, and so many more. And these are used to emphasize certain moments, like they can handle rhythmic percussion, right? Rhythmic patterns, or they can just emphasize certain moments with other sections. Like maybe there's a really important theme and you want to use some percussion to bring it out a little bit, add a bit of attack at the beginning of the notes. You can use percussion there as more decoration, right? So that's really cool too. So let me go over a few orchestral articulations. A lot of people ask about articulations. What are they and how do you use them? These are just a few that are super common. So sustains, of course, when you have longer held notes, those are when you sustain the notes. Pretty self-explanatory. Legato is when you connect multiple notes that are different. So for example, if I'm going from a C to a D, C, D, C, D, I'm transitioning from one note to another in a smooth manner. And what a lot of sample libraries will do is they record that transition between two different notes all the way up to an octave, so you can create realistic melodies just by using those legato transitions, those legato patches, which is amazing. So if you want to write a melody with orchestral instruments, most likely you're going to be using legato in some form. Staccato is kind of the opposite. You're playing relatively short note values, and spiccato is a string-only articulation where you bounce the bow off the strings. So in effect, it creates a more intense staccato because it's basically forced to be short as the bow is bouncing off the string. You have pizzicato, which is where you pluck the strings with the fingers. Again, that's only for strings. Accents are more applicable to the different sections. You can play with more emphasis. There's a stronger attack on particular notes around them. And yeah, a sudden strong attack is called sforzando. So it's a really strong attack that it's like a big accent, basically. We have marcato, which is when you play in a more deliberate, marked manner, again used to emphasize some notes, but maybe not quite as strong as the accent. The Bartok pizzicato is strings only again. This is otherwise known as snap pizzicato, where you pluck the string with such force that when you release, the string snaps back and hits the fingerboard on the way, and it creates a really percussive sound along with hearing the note that you've plucked. Colegno is the final one I've written here, and that's when you bounce the back of the bow off the strings, and again, that's strings only. It still has a bit of a percussive sound, but it's lighter than the Bartok pizz. But these are just a few of them that you can kind of play around with. You should definitely, if you already have some sample libraries, which we'll talk about in a minute, play around with them, right? Play around with your articulations and see which ones you like, which ones you don't. They're just a really great learning tool in general, okay? Let's also move on to my favorite sample libraries like I just talked about. So you definitely don't need to have these. If you have your favorites, definitely stick with them. But if you're looking to maybe expand your palette or maybe reaffirm the ones you already have, maybe this will help you. So the first company I use all the time is Cinematic Studio Series, a very consistent set of libraries. They're really well programmed in terms of the legato, the articulations, everything, and it's relatively affordable. You can get started with the strings for $400. A lot of higher end string libraries or top shelf libraries, I should say, charge like upwards of $1,000 per section. So, you can get a bit of comparison there. The next one is Cinesamples. They have a beautiful sound recorded in the Sony scoring stage in Los Angeles. Really unique programming as well out of the box and still relatively affordable. Very similar to Cinematic Studio Series in that regard. I actually use both of these companies the most in my workflow and then a sprinkle of these other companies I'm about to mention. Next, we have Orchestral Tools, and they're known for a really beautiful, detailed sound, but it comes at a cost, literally, in terms of price. So they're one of the top shelf companies, and the libraries used to be quite heavy on the CPU. I'm talking mainly about the Contact versions using the capsule system that they created, but now they have their own player called Sine, and you can run their libraries there, and I believe it's more efficient nowadays, which is really good. Then we have Spitfire Audio. I think most people have heard of Spitfire. Their libraries usually feature a pretty full and rich sound because a lot of them are recorded in the Air Studios Hall in London. And they also have a really large catalog as well for really composers in the whole market. So there's a variety of pricing from free all the way to thousands of dollars per library. You can really get anything you want from Spitfire. So yeah, they basically have something for everyone. Then we have performance samples, which have very lively and musical samples, but yet are noisy in a musical way. That's part of performance samples philosophy. I personally really like this, but other people might want to be or might want samples that are more pure and are more sterile and don't have any background noise, and that's totally fine as well. Musical sampling is another great one. They have really bright, energetic, and responsive samples featuring a slightly more modern sound because it has that processing to it. And Audio Imperia is another great one, a good mix of orchestral samples and sound design. So it's really good if you want that authentic feel with the orchestra, but you want a slightly more processed sound, similar to musical sampling in that regard as well. Okay? But no matter which developers you pick, you should learn from your libraries. So figure out how the instruments sound, like bring them in one at a time into your DAW, play around with the different ranges, hear where the instruments sing the best, right? Where their tessituras are, figure out which articulations you like. Just get the sound of the instruments in your head first, because that's a really great way to decide what instrument do I want later for my arrangements. So get to know the instruments really, really well, and they're a great accompaniment to videos and textbooks, kind of like supplementary material. All right, so these are some of my favorite sample library developers. Now, let me quickly walk through, I think, the best way to think about orchestration, because a lot of students get overwhelmed, right? They're like, what's the best way to think about the color palettes or all the instruments? Because there's so many possibilities. I just have no idea where to start. And that, like, let alone doubling and combinations and all that. Well, once you understand how each instrument works and sounds, like we talked about using your sample libraries, reading textbooks, watching videos, the best way to think about the orchestra is as a color palette. So if you literally consider yourself like an artist, like a visual artist that you're painting, think about it like that. You can use just the primary colors, which I like to think of it as the individual instruments, or maybe in the sections, right? Doesn't matter, ensembles or solo. So those are the exposed colors on their own, or secondary, tertiary colors. When you double or layer combinations together, you create new colors and new textures that might work for your piece of music, but you just kind of have to experiment. But you can see this is more of a minimalist mindset when you think about it as starting from the very basics, learning what each instrument sounds like, but then thinking for the context of your piece, which sound, which effect would match that line that I'm writing the best. So I like to think of it in terms of these sort of colors. It's instead of visual colors, it's just audio colors, right? It's different, but the same. So you want to think about the color and the emotion that you're trying to achieve, and then correlate that with how you personally interpret each instrument, and you just want to trust your instincts. If you overthink it, it's going to feel overwhelming and you're going to go back to square one. So really think about how each instrument makes you feel and the color that it creates. So you can think about it as two questions. Ask yourself these two questions. Number one is, what emotional response are you attempting to achieve? Is this melody supposed to be happy? Is it sad? Is it scary, right? Answer that question first, and then you can go to the second question, which is, which instruments will enable me to achieve that emotion, texture, atmosphere? So I might consider a solo violin happier if it's playing that line, or maybe I consider a bassoon a sadder instrument for myself when it's playing sustains or legato if it's a longer line, right? So you can see how this really bases our decision making in the musical sense. It's not so much technical as it is asking ourselves how each instrument makes us feel and what emotion are we trying to achieve in our music, in maybe a particular line, and then selecting the corresponding instrument that gives us that feeling and then putting it into the line that you're trying to write. Okay. So it's a lot simpler. I think it's a lot more effective, and it just makes things more enjoyable as a whole when you're writing and arranging. Okay. That is step number 3, arranging and orchestration. Step number 4 is then mixing and mastering, the step that a lot of composers are scared of. So I'm just going to lay it out here. My 6-step mixing and mastering formula, it's super simple. You can take this, plug it into your workflow, and you'll see how simple this is. Number 1 is not even mixing. It's actually organization and grouping. So this is where I get all of my tracks, everything ready in terms of coloring, like color coding all the different sections. I'll make the strings all one color. I'll make the woodwinds a different color. And so my session looks pretty colorful, but it's only 4 main colors because there's 4 main sections of the orchestra, right? Strings, winds, brass, percussion. I also organize it from strings down to winds, down to brass, down to percussion, and then I have some tracks for other stuff as well. But the most important thing here is that you make sure the session is as clean as possible for you to work in for the upcoming steps. Being pre-mix EQ. So this is where we prime the individual tracks for mixing, and this step probably takes the most time. So if you have tracks that have frequencies that are maybe a little offensive, that just don't contribute very much to the mix or are actually detracting from the arrangement, then you want to apply an EQ to those tracks and then notch out the frequencies that are offensive, right? So in a lot of orchestral libraries, they come with a lot of room rumble in the low end, and that's something you don't want because over the course of lots and lots of tracks, that room sound actually builds up and it creates a really muddy, woofy sort of sound. So you want to get rid of that by applying high pass filters and getting rid of the low end for the tracks that especially have a lot of that low end. And a lot of EQs show you the visual graph of the frequencies as they're being played, so you can visually see that as well. So basically, you're just cleaning up the tracks so they are ready for you to mix in the next step. And that is the static mix. That's step number 3, which is where we volume balance from scratch, because the essentials of mixing really is volume balancing. So you take all your tracks, you bring them down to the very bottom so you hear nothing. Then you take the most important element, you bring that up to a healthy level, and then you balance every instrument around that main element one track at a time. So this is really exciting because you literally hear the arrangement coming together by adding one instrument at a time. And this is a great place to really ask yourself, is every instrument that I put in here necessary? Like if you're bringing up the fader for one instrument and it isn't really contributing to the overall track, then maybe you don't even need it. Maybe you can delete it or just mute it. So why take up more space in the frequency spectrum with instruments that aren't even helping the arrangement, right? So static mix is really, really essential here, using your volume faders first. Then we move on to the actual processing, the top-down mixing. So top-down mixing simply means you process from the master bus first, then you work down to the group tracks if you have any, and then down to the individual tracks to finish things up. A lot of composers go the opposite way. They start from the individual tracks, they get every element sounding good, then they apply processing to the group tracks, and then finally the master track. I like to work the opposite way because I find it a lot faster and a lot more inspirational as well. So I can hear, like if I do EQ moves on the entire mix by putting an EQ on the master track and then put a compressor, put a sweetener maybe, I can do some subtle moves and hear the entire mix change for the better, and I'm only making subtle moves. Then I can move on to the group tracks or the individual tracks if there are other things that need to be tweaked from there. But processing the master fader first gets me about 80% of the way to a finished mix in my opinion, because the whole thing is gelling together as a whole, and then you get down to the specifics more and more. Make sense? Step number 5 is then automation. And usually for me, this will be volume automation because all my processing is already done. So this includes like final balances, any polishes I have to do to really just make it sound professional and complete. This is where I'll do that here. So I close my eyes, I listen through the entire thing, and I ask myself, are there any bumps or notches? Are there any, or holes maybe instead of notches? Like, are there any spots where it feels like the energy is dropping too much? Or are there places where it feels like things are bumping out of the mix too much? Maybe something's too loud or something's fighting in the mix, right? So this is where I can make those final adjustments and sweeten it up a little bit more. And then finally, we have the quick master. So this is where we wrap up the piece, do a tiny bit of EQ and compression just to really polish it up, bring it up to that commercial level, use a limiter, and make it commercially viable. And that is the full process, okay? So you can see how streamlined and simple this is. This is what I follow every single time, and it served me well over the years. That leads us to the final step, step number 5, which is releasing and publication. So what should we do after we complete our piece, right? Do we just keep it for ourselves or do we put it out there? And there are 3 things that I think you should consider. Number 1 is to release it publicly into the world for all to see. So you could use a distribution platform for this like DistroKid or CD Baby or whatever. Number 2 is you could build your portfolio. So you're not really worrying so much as an artist, you're more thinking about building a portfolio, right? Building a collection of tracks for potential clients to see. So you can do this using SoundCloud or YouTube like I do. Or third and finally, you can submit it to a production library or a publisher. And in this case, you might not want to submit it publicly first because a lot of libraries don't let you share it publicly with anyone else, So these are 3 different methods you can use. You could do all 3 using the same piece of music. It just depends on how lenient your publisher is. So you want to figure out if it's an exclusive or a non-exclusive deal, meaning are they going to make sure you only submit your track to them and nowhere else? That would be exclusive or non-exclusive. So you can submit your track to as many places as you want, right? There's pros and cons to both. Non-exclusive usually results in fewer pay and less effort on the library's part to place it, whereas exclusive, they know you're only submitting your track to them, so they'll work harder to get your track placed in somewhere, right? So you just got kind of have to figure that out. Now, I personally prefer uploading my tracks to DistroKid first to get it out into all the major platforms. And then I also upload it on YouTube as a separate playlist on my channel to share it with my primary audience. And that is where my primary audience is, right? If you're watching this, most likely you found my YouTube content in some form. So yeah, I have a separate playlist for my music, both songs and pieces without vocals. And yeah, I like to have my music up there as an artist as well. Okay. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to what your personal intention is. So, what do you really want for your music? Ask yourself first, and then once you answer that question, then you can consider these three options by only doing one of them or multiple, completely up to you. So, hopefully that was helpful. Let me quickly recap the framework here. Number one is the composition. So, where we get those musical ideas down, we write, we develop, and complete our piece. Number two is the production. So again, we're getting into technology, using the right tools effectively to produce the desired sounds we hear in our head, getting those basics of the home studio down. Number three is orchestration, applying the right instrumentation to your music. So now you're taking the notes, but you're applying instrumentation to those ideas to really bring out the musical message and touch your listener. Number four is mixing and mastering, polishing your track to a professional level by making it sound cohesive and satisfying. And step number five is releasing and publication. Once you're done, you put your music out there in the world and not forget about it, but at least it's something you can't tinker with anymore because you've finished it, right? You let go of it, and that's the best feeling ever. So now you have the complete roadmap to go from initial idea to published track. You can see how simple this is, but it's really, really practical as well. And I really want you to follow this if you don't have a framework yet. And of course, I promised you my virtual orchestration roadmap, so let me share that with you too. This is so juicy. Again, this is the process I follow with my students every time when coming up with virtual orchestrations. So number one is the sketch. This is where we outline the piece of music using the bare bones. So let's say we have our piano sketch, right? We have our basic melody and harmony down in our DAW. Now you can take, let's say, ensemble patches, let's say it's a string patch, and you know you want it to be a string melody of some sort, but you don't really know which instruments yet. You can just play it in, even if it's polyphonic patch. You just play in your melody using that ensemble patch. Maybe also use the ensemble patch for chords underneath, right? So string chords underneath, get those down. Maybe you know you want a woodwind instrument playing another melody and you don't know exactly which one. Well, just choose a random woodwind that fits in the register or the octave that your melody is in, play that line, and then you have that woodwind sound in. So the whole idea is just to get the bare bones of the instrumentation down, and you don't need the absolute specific instruments yet. But we do in step two, which is laying the actual foundation, applying the core instrumentation. You want to nail down those essentials, right? So now it's not just, oh, I hear a string melody. Well, which instruments are going to be playing that string melody? Is it an ensemble violin? Is it a violin solo? Is it a viola solo, right? So now you have to really nail down those decisions to tell you the exact instruments you want to perform those fundamentals in your sketch. So I know that, for example, I really want strings to play an ostinato or a rhythmic pattern in the background. Well, I'm going to make sure that's laid down. Most likely I'll use the cellos and basses if it's harmony in the mid-low range, right? So here we're getting those foundations down. All the necessary instrumentation is going in. That's step number two. Step number three is the polish, the details. So now we apply the rest, taking it from 90% to 100%, giving it that final touch. So this could be things like ear candy and flourishes to spice up the rest of the arrangement. For me, these would include, like we said, ear candy like glissandos, harp glissandos, or string runs, woodwind runs, little tinkles of stuff here and there, maybe some sound effects, right? Things that are not necessarily the essential instruments, but things that add that touch of spice at the very end and just make it even more satisfying and exciting to listen to. So those are the three steps. The sketch, getting the basics down first in a general sense, not having to commit to the instruments just yet, but at least the general texture. Then the foundation, nailing down the specific instruments you want for your melody, your harmony, your rhythm, everything. And then the details, step number three, is the cherry on top, the ear candy, the glissandos, the string runs, the the pads, maybe if you're feeling something is lacking a little bit, just filling in the rest of the arrangement with stuff that makes it feel more satisfying and enjoyable, right? That's the three-step process, and hopefully that should make sense. So if you follow this, every time you're going to have an enjoyable orchestration workflow. It's almost inevitable, right? And a tip I can give here is to not aim for perfection, but rather an enjoyable and satisfying listening experience throughout. That's what we should be aiming for. I mean, how do you even define the word perfect, right? Perfection. It's basically not really possible in music. So go with what is satisfying, what's enjoyable, and then you know that you have finished your orchestration. Make sense? So that's the roadmap. So let me quickly ask you, over the past hour, has this material been helpful? I really hope so. I hope this gave you a really good overview of what these steps are, how you can orchestrate effectively using the roadmap we just talked about. Now, obviously, it would be impossible to cover every single thing we knew about the music making process in a single hour, right? We've barely scratched the surface, but you can see how much stuff there is to talk about, not to mention, all the sub steps within each of the framework steps we talked about today. I do have something really special I want to share with you so that you can uncover everything you need to know about making incredible music from your home studio. A process where I can share everything over the shoulder, demonstrating the exact framework we talked about in this workshop in real time. So, like literally in my DAW, that you can follow along every step of the way, creating your own stunning orchestral tracks from start to finish. Seriously. Are you ready for this? I certainly am. This is something I put together for my students because they've been asking for it, and I know it can help you as well. And that is the Complete Composers System. So what is this, you might be asking? It's an end-to-end turnkey system that enables you to compose, produce, orchestrate, mix, and master your tracks with clarity and confidence, very, very important, creating an impact in the world with your music and touching lives as well. And if you asked me, the joy of making music, what does it come down to? It comes down to this, what we just said. Creating music, of course, we want to master all those necessary steps we just talked about, composing, producing, etc. But if we put music out there and it touches people in a positive way, then isn't that amazing? Like that's the best feeling, right? When you put something out there that people appreciate, that's the best. Absolutely. So what will the system help you do? Well, first of all, it will help you write timeless melodies that people remember for decades, not minutes, not days, months, decades, okay? Create gorgeous chord progressions that enhance your musical message and deliver emotional impact, because we know harmony is really, really important. Choosing the right instrumentation for your track so you can orchestrate with confidence no matter the genre every single time. Orchestration is so, so important. You can also master your sample library so you can create professional sounding mockups using your libraries of your choice, like the ones we talked about earlier here today. Also, mix and master your tracks for a polished, clean, and rich sound. So my full mixing and mastering workflow from start to finish. And publishing your music effectively and begin building that audience who loves your music and wants more of what you do. So you can see this is the complete music making process in its entirety using this system. So you might be asking, well, what's actually inside? What is this? Well, first of all, my cinematic music creation course, my flagship composing system, is part of this system. It's $500 in value, and it's my end-to-end framework for composing, producing, orchestrating, and mixing and mastering a piece of music from start to finish. I'll share with you the essentials of practical music theory, so no fluff, laying a solid foundation for any track you write. So you don't need to know things that you don't need to know, right? I'll also share a simple composing framework to kickstart your creative process, even if you're facing writer's block. And this helps a ton of my students. Core principles of orchestration and a live mockup demonstration the entire way through from start to finish to put what you learn into practice. Also, my 6-step mixing and mastering workflow in real time, like we mentioned, that you can copy and paste immediately into your own workflow, as well as personal branding techniques so you can begin building an audience and create an impact in the world. So that's number 1, cinematic music creation. Number 2 is virtual orchestration mastery. And I'm sure you can guess what this course is about from the title, but this goes into a deep dive into the philosophy and science behind virtual orchestration and what makes it such a beautiful craft. We'll go over things such as popular doubling techniques and combinations for creating rich, unique timbres, how to choose the right articulations for your instruments every single time using a specific framework, my 3-step framework for selecting the proper instruments for your music no matter what. This one is really, really important, by the way. I do this every single time. how to get the best out of your sample libraries through MIDI CC massaging and effective programming, how to program effective ostinatos and satisfying orchestral transitions. So you can see like there's a lot of stuff in here. These are just a few of the highlights, but if you were interested about mockups, how to actually get the best out of your sample libraries, make it sound realistic and enjoyable, this is that course that you want to dive into. And the last one here is how to orchestrate in various styles like action, romance, comedy, how to choose the right instruments for those styles as well. Little bonus there. Number 3 is composing with color. This is $400 in value as well as virtual orchestration mastery. And this one is a composing program that moves beyond the basics, like of just melody writing and composing, harmony and stuff, but it actually equips you with the tools and techniques to compose emotional, impactful, and satisfying music that touches people for a lifetime. Okay. So, in other words, it teaches you how to make your music stand out using certain musical devices. We'll talk about how to write memorable melodies using my 6-step melody writing framework, how to take advantage of non diatonic harmony for unique colors in your music, how to choose the perfect form and structure for your piece with multiple examples, of course, really practical. Also, the evolution of Western music and how our music is influenced by films, video games, and mainstream music, because it's really important to know where our music came from, like a brief history of that. And also composer blueprints. This is kind of like a little secret to incorporate tried and true techniques used by the masters into your own tracks. I'm sure you've heard of the saying, good composers copy or something, and then great composers steal, right? So this is a chance for us to steal those techniques, use them in our music, and kind of um, evoke the sense of these masters who know exactly what they're doing. Okay. So these 3 courses alone cover the entire process from start to finish. The composing, the production, the orchestration, the mixing and mastering, all of that is included in these 3 flagship courses. But to sweeten the deal even more, I want to give you some bonuses. The first one is EDU discounts to sample libraries, right? So actual discounts to libraries that you're looking at. And this is $300+ in value as I add more developers to the list. The value continues to go up more and more as you save more and more money from libraries. So it'll give you those exclusive discounts, including Spitfire Audio, Cinesamples, Cinematic Studio Series, Heaviosity, musical sampling, Project Samps, Dreadsaw sampling, and many more as well. And again, I'm continuously adding to this. So you're going to either enter a custom code at checkout or reach out to the company directly with your receipt of the purchase, and they will take care of you from there. Okay. You'll find all those EDU codes at the beginning of my cinematic music creation course, just so you know. And like I said, I'm continually updating this list as I partner with more developers and add more to the roster. So that's bonus number 1, getting those EDU discounts. Number 2 is my Freedom Behind the Album course. So this is an in-depth look at my process for writing and orchestrating my debut album Freedom, which I released in, I think it was 2020. I think it was 2 years ago now. 3 years ago, actually. How to put together an album that flows with cohesion and creates a satisfying listening experience from start to finish. Really important. If you ever considered releasing an album, you got to know how to make it structured so it flows and it's satisfying, right? Also, some distribution strategies for sharing my music to the stores, creating an online presence as well as an artist, and some music theory and DAW sessions for every single track. So those styles include like radio pop, rock, musical theater and Broadway, easy listening, a cappella, and many more. This album was basically a project of self-expression to uncover all the influences I've had throughout my life. So I kind of go into all those different influences and how they impacted the music itself as well. The last thing I share here is also my simple studio setup. I talk a lot about how I like a minimal approach, but you'll actually get to see the tools I use as well for my studio. Okay. Next, you're going to receive a course I don't share anywhere else, and this is called the Love Themes System. And this is $100 in value, covering exactly how to write music that evokes that timeless era of romance and love. We'll cover things such as how to write gorgeous melodies that beg repeated listens, not just a one-time listen, how to create beautiful chord progressions that support your theme and enhance its musical message, how to craft lush orchestrations that move the heart and gives the listener a euphoric listening experience. So a really enjoyable, really satisfying listening experience, as well as my favorite sample libraries for writing love music and some practical critical listening examples to put everything we learn into practice and internalize all of the concepts, taking notes on what we hear. So again, this is one that I don't share anywhere else, but you'll be getting this as a part of the system when you join us today. Another bonus I want to give to you here is probably one of the most valuable ones, and that is a custom track review. This is something I normally charge $300 for separately, but you're going to get this in the system today. So, when you have your music reviewed by trusted source, that is the single fastest way to improve and the best way to learn, right? Because you have that custom constructive critique on elements you may not have considered or heard before, or simply new things that you want to try out. And you might not be able to figure those things out on your own, and that's totally fine. But that's why having personal access is so important. And my students get the most value not only when they see my complete process, but also when they hear my thoughts on their music and how they can improve, right? Courses, memberships are great, but when you actually have that personalized feedback, that is the key really to improving quickly. And I normally charge $300 per track review, like I mentioned, but it's yours totally free when you purchase this bundle today. So let me just quickly recap here. You're getting cinematic music creation, which is $500 in value. You're getting virtual orchestration mastery, $400 in value. Composing with color, $400 in value. And then you're getting these bonuses, right? The EDU discounts, the freedom behind the album mini course, it's more it's actually a full course, MIDI mockup secrets, and the custom track review. All of this adds up to over $2,000 in value, $2,200 to be exact. Let me just go over the quick alternatives with you here. So, I mean, you could go with me, right? Obviously, but what are some other avenues you have available to you? Well, you could go to school for music. And I get this question all the time. Chris, what are the pros and cons of going to school for music? Well, first of all, the main con I think is the pricing. Usually it costs quite a bit, and it can cost upwards of 8,000 per semester. I actually paid 40,000 for my entire piano performance degree. Obviously, that's not pocket change, right? And for music at that. So yes, it can cost a lot to go to school for music and more. This is on the lower end. I visited Berkeley for a 1 week songwriting workshop. I was really interested, and it ran me nearly $3,000 after everything. So that's expenses, living there, food, and yeah, for 1 week, 3K. You could also hire a composer or arranger to flesh out your ideas, right? Like a professional, but they can charge anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 per track pretty easily. They can even go higher if they're higher up in the industry. Even good mixing engineers' rates start at $500 per mix, while mastering engineers usually charge around $100 per track. And these are pretty standard rates for good engineers, so don't be surprised or taken aback or offended if they charge these prices. They're pretty typical. So recording an entire album of songs can cost you over $20,000 on the low end once you consider hiring musicians or studio time or hiring engineers, right? All of this adds up. Not to mention hiring a live orchestra if you want to do that. That can run you upwards of 100K dollars or whatever currency you have. Think about the performers again, the venue, the engineers, the logistics of setting everything up. It really is so expensive nowadays. But again, you're paying for the musician's time and their experience as well. So these are definitely all possibilities you can consider. But for a lot of us, it's just not as manageable. So that brings us to, what does this system cost, right? You're probably asking that. So I mean, you can see why the system is more than worth it at $2,200 with everything you're getting and learning here. I did consider selling the system for even half this, like $1,100, but because you took the time to watch this entire workshop today, you can get started with a one-time payment of $497. So that's over 75% off for the entire bundle, plus all the bonuses we just talked about. Okay? By the way, you're also covered by my 60-day money-back guarantee, so it's really, really simple. If you don't feel like I deliver the goods to justify your investment within those first 60 days, then you can email me anytime and I'll refund your entire purchase, no questions asked. You truly have no risk. I really want this material to help you. It's helped a bunch of my students, and I know it can do the same for you. But in case you're on the fence, just know that you can you're backed by this guarantee as well. Okay? Now, quickly, what do most composers end up doing following materials like this, like workshops or watching YouTube videos or anything like that? Well, they work on their own, right? They isolate themselves from the rest of the community without trusted peers to turn to for support and encouragement. And it's really unfortunate. It makes sense too, though, right? Because composers are naturally introverted and we make music on our own. So this is just an opportunity for us to continue doing that. They also watch countless YouTube videos, trying to absorb every new technique. They track down every new sample library in hopes that it'll be the next secret sauce for their next track, making it sound so much better, right? Gear acquisition syndrome is such a real thing. They browse countless forums for advice, running into conflicting information and inflated egos everywhere, so you don't even know what is correct information and what's not. And what's worse, they can even condescend to you, right? They can talk down to you, and that kills the motivation altogether. No one wants that. And they just end up feeling overwhelmed, confused, and they're exactly where they started, which is a terrible cycle. And so many composers go through this. So then you might be asking, can I really do this, right? Imposter syndrome is such a real thing. Am I a good fit for this music making journey? And the answer I truly believe is yes. I really think that you can learn to do everything, all this music making by yourself by learning these skills. So it's really possible to create orchestral music using your sample libraries that compares with the pros from your home studio. It's so simple, it's so accessible nowadays, and that is the truth. You just need a process to follow, a system that can show you every step of the way, leaving no stone unturned and encouraging you along the way. So yes, the encouragement I really do believe in as well. Like, you know how information is can be so dry nowadays, right? Especially with textbooks and reading. I like books, but that's one of the downsides for me. But a lot of students have actually told me that one big benefit to the material that I share is that there's a sense of encouragement to it, and I truly believe in that. Like, I really do think that you can do it. So I wouldn't be sharing this if I didn't think it was possible, right? But I think it is important. Most successful composers today have multiple of these skills we covered today, like composing, orchestration, mixing, etc. And they're involved in a lot of the process and create amazing sounding demos, even if they're eventually performed by a live orchestra. And one example that comes to mind is John Powell. He has a huge template and he creates incredible mockups, even though those are going to be going to real orchestras anyway, so he doesn't even need a mockup in the first place. But it's all possible. And luckily, we have the resources, like we said, available to simplify the process. And this is the system that will uncover everything you need to know to create incredible music. So let's quickly recap here. You're going to get cinematic music creation. You'll get virtual orchestration mastery. You'll get composing with color. These are the 3 flagship courses that cover the entire system. But just to sweeten the deal, you're also going to get those exclusive EDU discounts, the sample libraries, freedom behind the album, MIDI mockup secrets, and a custom track review, all adding up to over $2,200 in value. You're going to get instant access to it today for $497. Okay? If you want some sort of payment plan, you can also email me at christopher.cu@me.com. I'm more than happy to work that out as well. But you can get started with a one-time payment of $497. It will be the cheapest option. So just so you know, that is a possibility. Okay? You should have a button below where you see that. If you want to explore that further, feel free to do so. This will be a limited time offer. I don't know if I'll be doing this again, but I wanted to share it with you as kind of a thank you for sticking with me today and going through this material. I hope it's been valuable. And I just want to leave you with one little gift, and that is a free guide I call the number one neglected technique to supercharge your compositions, orchestrations, and mixes. This is not something I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, right? So if you stuck around to the very end, this is a little perk, okay? Something I just wanted to give you. And this is something that, yeah, a lot of composers forget about. They wonder why their music sounds a little flat and they have trouble with the process. If they knew about this technique and they incorporated it, it would make a world of difference for them. And so you'll find out exactly what this is. You can go to christophercu.com/neglected-technique to grab it there. I'll leave this up for a second so you can see it and you can type it in. Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's just a little extra gift as a thank you for watching through today. Well, thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate your time. I do know that your time is valuable, and the fact that you took the time to actually pick up some value along the way, apply the material to your workflow, and make a difference to your music means the world to me, right? I don't take it lightly, and I really do appreciate you taking the time. Thank you again. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in another training very, very soon, whether in something like this, a workshop, or on a free YouTube video. But in either way, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you again. Take care, and I'll see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.